If you're a regular listener to this podcast, you know I believe demographics are going to drive our property markets moving forward. And it's actually the changing demographics, how many of us there are, how we want to live, and where we want to live, that are going to be much, much more important over the long term than the short-term fluctuations caused by rising interest rates or government interference. That's why I enjoy my monthly chats with leading demographer Simon Kuenstenmacher. And today we're going to spend some time navigating the new normal as we talk about how our Australian cities are going to need to change for a sustainable future. You're going to hear Simon explain how it's possible our population will double in 60 years. Now that's hard to fathom considering it's taken us over 200 years to get to Australia as in the size we know it today. So is this growth sustainable? And how are we going to keep our lifestyle standards in the face of these changes? That's what we're going to talk about today. And if you're interested in property investment, these trends are going to be really important for you to understand. So let's get on with the show.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment, and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
In today's show, we're going to delve into a thought-provoking article in the New Daily by my guest Simon Kuenstenmacher, where he explained how Australian cities are going to have to change to move forward. Now, I want to ask Simon about some of the historical facts that shaped our cities in the past, some of the challenges we're currently facing, and the innovative solutions that could redefine urban living in Australia. Now, if you don't know Simon, he's a leading demographer. He's a co-founder of the Demographics Group. And Simon's a regular columnist in the New Daily. I love reading his column every Sunday. And in the Australian newspaper, shares his thoughts as well on socio-demographic trends. And Simon consults to Australian government departments, institutions and companies. And I'm pleased he's a regular guest on this podcast. Hi, Simon.
Hi, Michael. Great to be back on.
Now, Simon, in your article, you mentioned that Australian cities were reshaped by factors such as home ownerships, post-war population growth, the introduction of affordable cars. We're going back before you were born, but when I guess, first came to Australia in the 50s. Can we just talk a little bit about how these factors impacted the urban landscape of Australian cities? Because then I'd like to have a bit of a talk about moving forward, what are going to be the forces, the drivers of change in our cities. That's obviously important for property investors, for business owners, for governments, for industry.
Oh, absolutely. And so traditionally we start plenty of observations about Australian urban developments right around the birth of the baby boomers. That really changed things just after the end of the Second World War, because then we saw this first massive Mediterranean wave of migration into Australia, and that really reshaped the way that we functioned. This is when Australia changed from a purely Anglo-British society into a more European society. We added not just Greek or Italian migrants, but we also added cultural affinities. We changed our consumption behaviors.
We changed our food, Simon. When I grew up, there was the fish and chip shop and the Chinese shop in every little shopping centre as well. And then pizza came. Pizza and spaghetti.
Yeah, and it really changed the world for the better in this country. And it also shows how we Australians take on new cultures. First, we take on their cuisines, and bit by bit, we normalize after generation the new sense of migrants. If you talk to old Mediterranean migrants, they were absolutely disgustingly treated in school. They were beaten. They were insulted. It was not a cool thing. They are just the dirty wogs and all those. They were just racial slurs left, right, and center. And nowadays, a Greek or Italian Australian is the stock standard, true blue Aussie that you can find. Sometimes this takes time, this integration of foreign cultures into the Australian framework. But overall, it happens. This doesn't make the individual suffering for somebody who was beaten up in the time easier. But overall, we're doing a great job.
Now, interestingly, if we look at the number of people that came, while we think we've got lots of people coming with about 500,000 people a year coming into Australia at the moment, there was a great wave in the 50s too, wasn't there?
Exactly. And in relative terms, this was probably more significant because Australia was much smaller then. And those people, of course, were different from today's migrants insofar as they weren't as skilled. We didn't have as many academics in there simply because we weren't an economy that needed all that many academics, and there weren't that many academics available across the world. And so these were hardworking people that really just wanted to, they literally were fleeing undesirable circumstances, incredibly low unemployment in Greece, in Italy after the war. So they changed that, hardworking working class families.
They also had the desire to own their home, Simon. That made a difference as well.
That's exactly it. And they had it not per se easy, but housing and land was available. At the same time, what we saw there bit by bit was the introduction of affordable cars. As the baby boomer cohort, people born in the 18 years following the end of the Second World War, as they grew up, cars became the norm. And that really unlocked whole areas of this continent. All of a sudden, you weren't bound to your place of work by commuting via a bicycle, via a public transport system that was very much in its infancy as well, a bus network, but you could use your own car. And so that drove urban sprawl. Essentially, people drove further into each direction until they could afford a house. And so we just built lots and lots of quarter-acre blocks, one after the next. You had a house, and this really became the identity-defying decade of Australia as we know it today. If you look at The Castle, the movie The Castle from 30 years ago, home ownership, this quarter-acre block, yes, it was a jokingly undesirable house. But it was a house, and it is your castle. It is something that you take a lot of pride in. And that is very much still baked into the Australian public consciousness and DNA even.
Well, it was one of the structural shifts that created the property boom at the time. There was lots more people, but also women joined the workforce, and the banks started to accept their income, but only a little bit. They didn't accept them as full income, but it brought more money into the household, didn't it?
Yeah, it really turbocharged spending capacity. If you go as a society bit by bit from one household income to 1.5 household incomes, there is more money to throw around. And the first things that we used that money on were labor-saving devices, your vacuum cleaners, your washing machines, your dishwashers, and then cars. And as cars became more affordable, even relatively low-income families could have a car and could therefore allow for a relatively long commute. And so everyone was able to buy a house because there was so much land out there, and our individual cities weren't that big yet that we ran into problems. A city can function with a single job center and a couple of industrial sites up to a certain size. And in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, those sizes weren't reached yet. So we could just continue this game onwards.
Well, you're bringing back some memories, me being a baby boomer and remembering how my parents bought their first home. We didn't actually get a car till I was about 8 or 9. We, in fact, lived with my grandparents, as a lot of migrants did, in 2 or 3 generations in the same home. And eventually my parents aspired to have a home. So that changed the demographic landscape, the urban landscape in the 60s and 70s. But by the 80s, things started to change, and particularly in the inner suburbs, as transport became easier, as factories moved from the inner CBD, or around the CBD and around the ports, to the end of the freeway, Simon.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the 80s, the inner suburbs emptied to a degree. We talk about donut cities sometimes. Nobody lives in the center. There's still jobs clustered in the center, but these are the undesirable destinations. So you move further out. But then bit by bit, Australia transitioned into the knowledge economy that it is today. And then all of a sudden, the inner suburbs become attractive again because there are more jobs nearby and cities grow bigger. So they become less, the commute becomes more annoying. So it's worth avoiding it a bit more. And so fewer workers needed to commute to factories that are not in the CBD, that are on what used to be the urban fringe back then. At the same time, we take money away from universities. We're defunding them bit by bit. So they get desperate for money and they figured out, hey, international students are willing to pay for university education. Then we open up the inner cities for our international fee-paying students. That, of course, is great for unis because it gives them dollars, but it also revitalizes, reactivates the CBDs. It's quite exciting when this happens to a CBD. All of a sudden, so much more employment opportunities pop up there.
Well, I remember the inner suburbs used to be the small working class cottages, and you can still see them today, but that's where the workers were because they would walk, ride their bike, or catch in Melbourne a tram to the factory, which was around the corner. Others didn't want to live right near the factories. But again, as we said, we became less a manufacturing country. The factories moved further out. And I guess more bohemian people moved into those inner suburbs, and people who wanted to work close to the universities and close to the CBD, they found it exciting and trendy to live in those workers' cottages and do them up.
Oh, exactly. It was relatively cheap housing. So that's always the idea. It's when we talk about the gentrification cycle happening. It was relatively affordable housing. You throw a bit of paint at those dwellings and they look kind of cool, kind of funky, kind of an alternative lifestyle. But what continued to happen is that these changes tend to be driven by relatively young people before they had families. But once they reached family formation stage of the life cycle, they then moved out. They then moved to the middle suburbs where you could buy a 3 to 4 bedroom house, your quarter acre block type property. That worked well because all of a sudden you have a healthy suburbia, you have a reactivated CBD, the transport system isn't at its absolute breaking point just yet. Ultimately, that was okay for towns to function this way. But bit by bit, as we grew our cities, that stopped working. We continued throwing more and more jobs at the city center because the whole economy moved more towards a knowledge economy. We didn't really invest enough into infrastructure, into our transport network. So then in order to avoid the soul-destroying commute, everybody moved as close as possible to the CBD. The poor people had to move further away. And so we segregate our city this way, bit by bit, on purely socioeconomic patterns.
Well, I know you love food analogies. So a while ago you mentioned that the CBDs, our cities, look like donuts with no one living in the centre. And I've seen your beautiful diagrams and analogies that this next stage then is they resembled the fried egg with the jobs concentrated in that yolk in the centre. But that's changed again, hasn't it?
Exactly. So these decades of the fried egg city with the egg yolk representing the high office towers in the CBD where we throw all of our jobs in, and the egg white representing where everybody lives, that changed essentially with the pandemic because we took a spatula to our fried egg city and turned it into a scrambled egg. We spread out those jobs evenly. Yes, there's still a CBD that is dominant, but overall, if you remember the heights of the lockdowns, people worked from absolutely everywhere in the city. And that changed the world of work quite dramatically because all of a sudden infrastructure needs are different, commutes are shorter, that's really cool. That is a major change. But the important takeaway lesson here is that this scrambled egg city is not just a result of COVID, but of pure demographic pressures. It would have occurred even without the pandemic because we have right now, it started by dumb luck, started with the pandemic, and it will continue for the next 13, 14 years. We have millennials making babies. That means millennials, people born in the 80s and 90s that are now making babies, they still live in the inner cities, in the inner suburbs of the hipster suburbs. And that means as they're adding those 1.7 babies to their families, they need to find a 3 to 4 bedroom house just to have enough room available. These houses, dwellings aren't available in the inner suburbs. They aren't available in the middle suburbs because in the middle suburbs, the baby boomer parents of those millennials are hogging the family-sized homes. They're not thinking of downsizing. And so the millennials need to jump to the urban fringe. That development, millennials from the inner city to the urban fringe, will permanently reshape the Australian settlement patterns over the next 13, 14 years. It's baked into the demographic pie.
Well, the theme of your article in the New Daily that we're discussing was that our cities are going to have to change moving forward. And I'd like to ask you in a moment how that's going to happen. But what about our migration? Because while there's the millennials, the Australians, going into the family formation stage, isn't that much the same age as a lot of the migrants as well?
To a degree. So lots of the migrants that come to Australia are very young. They're international students. So about 80% of all migration into Australia is aged 18 to 39. So that means that the vast majority of migrants come here as either single international students or as couples without kids. So that means they at least initially move right smack bang into the center of town because that's where the jobs are and that's where the office locations are and that is where the universities are in most cities. So that trend will continue, and we are, as a country, we're doubling down on international education as much as we can. There's no plan in sight to lower migration intake from an international student perspective. So that will really already is activating inner city suburbs. That is driving demand for specialized property like purpose-built student accommodation. That I don't see stopping this in the near future.
Now, housing affordability is obviously a major concern. You can't open up a paper or read a blog without seeing about that at the moment, and there seems to be no end in sight to that. But in your article, you mentioned that we're going to need to densify our cities moving forward. Why are you suggesting that?
Well, densification helps us to limit traffic problems. So if we constantly sprawl out, if everybody continues to live in a quarter-acre block type house, that means we reach the capacity of our cities. We bring population into a denser urban framework. We can afford better infrastructure. We can allow for more workers to have, sometimes we talk about the 30-minute model of a city where all the basic functions of your life can be reached within a 30-minute time frame. That's a bit idealistic probably for all of those functions. And comparatively to international cities, we have outrageously low densities. Those numbers don't tell you anything. We have about 1,700 people per square kilometer in Melbourne, 2,200 or thereabouts in Sydney. That's just numbers. But you want to know that Barcelona has twice that, 4,500. London has 3 times that, 6,000 something. We are lagging behind. We are even less dense than some of the American cities that are famously spread out. And at a certain point in time, cities stop functioning well with a single CBD. So we then need to rethink whether we want to have several CBDs.
So several CBDs is one answer. The other is more medium density dwelling and building it at scale. At the moment, we're not building enough high-rise or medium-density dwellings. I think there's 2 sides to it. One is currently in the current market with the rising cost of construction, it's just not financially viable. But the other is the town planning issues as well and the NIMBYs. So in Europe, as you go out of the CBD, all of a sudden there's lots of medium-density dwellings. I think the other interesting thing I've realised in Europe is people hold on to their properties a lot longer, don't they? They stay within families for a long time.
Yes, there are plenty of nice things to unpack here. Historically speaking, the medium density in Europe, that was just done bit by bit because you moved into these types of dwellings. You built them bit by bit. In Australia, we turbocharged the whole urban development framework, meaning we built the New York City in the city center, and then everybody lived in a quarter-acre block until, we stopped doing this. That's unsustainable, but it also means that by now, you can't possibly build medium density. Because in order to build this Euro block, so if you think about a standard street block in Paris or London, it's called a Euro block, takes about 12 quarter-acre blocks to build one of those. How can you buy up 12 consecutive quarter-acre blocks? It's very difficult. You need to land bank for years to do this. It's very complicated. Let's say you manage to pull it off and get that much land. At that point, you might as well not build 5 stories, but you might as well build 25 stories on that block. We are forcing ourselves to miss this middle, the medium density that is in urban development language quite often hailed as an ideal stage of building density because you still have a shop fronts on the bottom. It's very walkable communities. You know your neighbors to a degree in those neighborhoods rather than into pure high-rise development. But adding those into an existing city is very, very difficult. You'd rather build skyscrapers then. That said, if we get serious about the population forecasts in Australia, we know that we will double the Australian population in just 65 years. That means in the 2080s, we'll have 52 million Australians, and we can't just simply double every city in size. We would really need to build up secondary cities at a much faster rate. That means that the outer suburbs of a Newcastle, of a Wollongong, and so forth, all of a sudden would be the middle suburbs of future Wollongong. That means building medium density housing on the urban fringe of our secondary cities is the absolute right tactic. It sounds a bit ludicrous to do this right now, but if you look at this from a decade-long perspective, that is exactly the type of development that I would embrace from an urban planning perspective.
That makes sense, but you've got to encourage councils to do this. They're holding it up with, I don't know, red tape, green tape. One department ping-pongs it to the next department. It's really hard to get things through council at the moment, isn't it?
It's a structural issue. So I'm always objecting to anyone who says my local councillors are incompetent or dumb. They might well be, but that's not the point. I'm pointing to a structural issue. I'm saying that an elected official in a local government area should, if they're self-interested, always block every development that comes their way, whether this is a good development or a bad development, because somebody will object to this development. If they're okay in development, they will make at least one or two enemies along the way. You might as well avoid it by not doing it. If you block this development and it's really needed, VCAT or NCAT or whatever will push it through the courts anyways, and then it gets built. The system encourages local councillors to be NIMBYs if they're self-interested. So what I'm suggesting is even harder than voting out your councillor and get a better dude in or something. I'm saying I want systemic change. And at the moment, to be quite honest, the state governments are well and truly onto this, as they are continuing the power grab away from local government. So there is no way that any local government in 5 years' time will be as strong or stronger as they are today. I'm seeing this power grab from the states because they want to avoid the NIMBYism within local government. They want probably go as far as setting specific housing targets in the future, meaning the state says, hey, Logan Council, you need 10,000 new dwellings. Hey, Redland Council, you need 2,000 new dwellings per year over the next 5 years, whatever it is. And they would then say, if you fail to do so, we'll withhold funding, or we might even put you under administration. That's the kind of future scenario. I'm not sure how likely it is, but I think it is at least very, very plausible.
So in your article, you mentioned that we've got to densify our Australian cities, and you've already given us an example how even though we think we're dense, no, we're not compared to other cities. But I hear you also suggesting that we should be building around our secondary cities, our smaller cities, not just on the urban fringe of the current 5 big capitals. I mean, that's a really unusual situation we're living in at the moment, isn't it? That most of us live in around 5 capitals, and in fact, most of us live around 3 of them, don't we?
Exactly. We are, in that perspective, the most clustered population in the world. There's no other country in the world, if you disregard city-states like Singapore, where such a high share of the population lives in the top 5 cities. 2/3 of us live in the biggest 5 cities. That is insane. That is, of course, historically grown because we developed every state the same way. We plonk in one state capital and a couple of secondary cities around it. That's it. And then a couple of functional towns to do mining or agriculture. That's it. But in an environment where we have the need, we have more knowledge economy jobs, we don't need to spread this way. We can double down on developing smaller cities at a much faster rate in the future so that our population is spread out a bit more evenly. Because it is very much possible to keep a city like Melbourne or Sydney functioning at 5 million people by investing heavily into infrastructure and so forth. It's probably not the smartest way as a nation to develop just a handful of cities. You'd probably be better off creating a string of pearls along the whole East Coast, if you will, Eastern Seaboard, where we have sizable cities. Then all of a sudden, if you have more towns, projects that are probably ludicrous right now, like a high-speed rail network along the coast, might become viable. The business travel will always take place in airplanes from airport to airport, but the casual visitation from one small town to the next, that stuff is probably better serviced in the long run in a rail capacity.
Well, you see that in Europe all the time, don't you? They're very efficient and it works well. They wouldn't think of doing it any other way. But I bet you somebody's listening to this and thinking, I've got the answer. Let's just stop migration. Why does Australia need so many more people? What would your answer be to them?
Well, I'm happy for people to use a low migration or no migration approach as long as they can solve quite a few problems. This is largely about economic growth and about taking care of the aging population. The aging of the population is so ludicrously high that most people are utterly unaware of it. We're doubling the 85 plus population in the next 12 years, from 500,000 people to over 1 million people. Half of those people, 85 plus, need care. We have nowhere near enough carers. If you're 75 right now and you think that in 10 years' time you'll have the care that you need, you better be pretty wealthy. Otherwise, you can forget this approach. So we'll therefore need to make sure that we import people. We also make sure that retirement, the quality of life of our retirees is capable by adding more people. So we have the ratio between workers and non-workers, retirees and kids at the same rate. As a nation, we are in the luxurious position where we can actually do this. We can pull this off because people still want to come to Australia. So it'd be pretty cool if we could do this. Ultimately, there are challenges with population growth, about traffic, about housing affordability, but these are not unsurmountable problems. They can very much be solved if we put our minds to it. And I think that the high migration approach is the most likely future scenario. So whatever you do, prepare for the most likely scenario, I would argue.
Well, be careful what you wish for and what you ask for, because somebody's going to have to pay for the healthcare. We know the healthcare system can't cope at the moment, and there's going to be more older people using the healthcare. We know that the pension system can't cope at the moment. There's more people going to pay for that. So if you don't want more people in Australia, workers paying for that, then you, those people younger than me, are going to be stuck in the workforce paying a higher percentage of tax. So as I say a moment ago, be careful what you ask for.
That is very true. So in general terms, this is of course a big oversimplification. The idea enough migration, whatever, these are being made by people that don't have too much tax paying in their future. Young people should absolutely embrace migration, because otherwise they will get the living hell taxed out of them. And already you could argue that millennials say that they are not receiving the same amount of services for their tax dollars that their parents' generation received. Millennials pay for their education through the HEC system, a relatively smart way of paying for education, so I like that, but they're paying for that. University isn't for free, though. Childcare isn't for free. They don't, through the way that they live, don't tend to have the luxurious opportunity of using grandparents as carers as much as it was the case in the past. So they carry higher costs on a day-to-day basis. And if they're then taxed more money, it doesn't take much for a millennial to be disappointed with the situation.
Well, I don't think we've solved the housing crisis in our conversation today, Simon, but we actually have talked a bit about what's going on. And if we're honest, we have to realise that moving forward, just like you took us through the history of how Australia's changed, this new wave of migrants is going to change us in ways maybe we don't fully know. But hey, that's your job as a demographer, as a futurist, to give us an idea of how to make our lives more pleasant, how to make Australia a nicer place to live moving forward. So I look forward to having a monthly chat with you on this podcast. Thanks for giving us some ideas about how to improve our cities. And I guess the bottom line is we're going to have to change, Simon.
Exactly. We do need to change. That's the worst thing is when you fight off change. You know for a fact that in 10 years' time, your city, your neighborhood will look different. So you need to take this as a given, and then instead of blocking change, try to proactively channel this growth into the most efficient way for Australians. So be proactive, don't be a victim of change.
Well said. Thanks for your time again, Simon.
It's been good fun.
I hope you enjoyed my chat with Simon Kuenstenmacher. And if you did, and you're not currently subscribed to this podcast, please stop for a sec. In a moment, I'm going to share my mindset message with you. But stop for a sec and subscribe or follow whatever your podcast app asks you to do, so that twice a week you're going to get these regular shows. And by the way, if you like my chat with Simon, he's been a regular guest for a number of years. You can go back into the archives. There's lots of great lessons. Each shows its own lesson on property investment, success and money. Now, one of the things you would have heard Simon and me discuss is how it's important to understand the demographic changes that are going to drive the shape of our cities, where people are going to want to live and how they're going to want to live. And one thing is certain, and that's that Australia's population is going to keep growing very quickly. In fact, estimates suggest that our population will double in the next 60 or 70 years. That's hard to fathom when you consider that it took us over 200 years to get to where we are today. So what are our cities going to look like? Obviously, we've got a housing problem at the moment, but if you look as long-term as an investor, you need to own the sort of property that's going to be in continuous strong demand, not just now, but if you think about it, you've probably got quite a few years before you retire, and possibly you're going to want to pass your properties on to your kids, so they've got to be in continuous strong demand for 30, 40, 50 years. So that's the sort of research that Metropole does, and why we love working with people like Simon. And demographics is going to describe our destiny, and it's going to determine the sort of properties that are going to outperform. That's one of the various areas our research department looks at. So I think it's going to be important. Actually, I know it's going to be important moving forward. So even though we're at the beginning of a new property cycle, and even though it's now a great time to take advantage of the next phase of the property cycle, you can't just buy any property. That's why I recommend you have a chat with our team at Metropole and have an obligation-free clarity consultation with one of our property strategists to discuss your goals, to discuss your options, and point you in the right direction. You see, property investment's a process. It's not an event. You can't just buy any property and hopefully it's successful, especially over the long term. So in my mind, formulating a plan and getting the right advice is more critical than ever now. And we're much more than just buyer's agents. We help our clients strategically grow their wealth safely so they can pass it on to future generations. So if you want to take advantage of the demographic changes, if you want to understand the research we're doing and why we're only selecting certain locations in each of the capital cities, go to metropole.com.au and have a chat with my team.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In my mindset message today, I'd like to talk about the 3 states of happiness. If we look closely, there are 3 ways to be happy. The first 2 are accessible in everyone's life, but the third one is rare. But the third one is the only one that stood the test of time for centuries. So the first way to be happy is to follow your impulses. Take life as it comes from moment to moment. Of course, this is the way of babies, of small children. They're motivated by the next thing that occurs to them. They've got little ability to predict what's going to turn out to be sad or glad, what's the right sort of experiences, the right things to do. This impulsiveness often lingers into many adults, but the vast majority of people move on to the second way of being. And the second way is to seek experiences that bring pleasure and minimise things that bring pain. Yet no matter how carefully you assess every situation, we often end up in relationships that have soured, or things that once excited us become boring. Psychologists have discovered that people are generally bad at predicting what's going to make them happy. Now that's interesting, isn't it? But there's a third way to be happy, and this is the eternal way, and it's the independent of the first 2. The third way is a state of being that requires a conscious effort. It happens when we make choices that include peacefulness over violence and anger, acceptance over tolerance of others, acting out of love, kindness and generosity. You enter this third realm of happiness by devoting your time to creative endeavours, by being of service, by being altruistic. You reach this third level of happiness by being independent of the good and bad opinions of others. It doesn't matter what they think. By not adding to your own stress or others' stresses around you. And by speaking and living your own truth. So recognising that happiness is a state of awareness rather than a planned or a predictable outcome, that interestingly frees you from all attachments. As Deepak Chopra says, being in a state of awareness spontaneously puts you in the correct path in every situation. So, ironically, the third way actually completes the circle. Because you're following your impulses as they arise, just like a young child, and taking life as it comes, It's sort of completing the circle. The difference is you're choosing to be in that state of childish wonder rather than being reactive to it. Now, I read that poet William Blake called this state organised innocence. In Buddhism and other Eastern traditions, it's called choiceless awareness. Choiceless awareness allows you to arise above ego levels, where you predict pleasure versus pain. It allows you to arise into a state where there's no dilemma, because every situation is meant for you. It's meant for you to enjoy an experience. According to ancient wisdom, there are many routes to this third way, including meditation, mindfulness, self-reflection. And without these practices, eternal happiness is a dream. So it's important to know this. You're not forced to choose between the first and second ways. Knowing that they're not going to lead to lasting happiness, no matter how hard you try, that's actually opening things up to the third way. It helps it emerge. So your intention sets the path in motion and unfolds every step along the way. Now that's interesting, because I can't think of a more important lesson of life that I can give you in today's session, because we all want to be happy, but many of us are not happy because of all the external things that are going on in this world. So drop the first way, just ceding to your impulses. Drop the second way, seeking out experiences, and start to pick up the third way by consciously behaving in certain ways that are going to give you the life that you deserve. Well, thanks for spending the last little while with me, and I hope you got some benefit from this show. If you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there's 3 little buttons down the bottom. Press it and share it, or just tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you'll definitely be doing me a favour and helping me in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. Now, there's ways of catching up with me between these shows. Just look for Michael Yardney on social media, or why not join my private Facebook group? Go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And I have a way of saying thank you to you for subscribing to this podcast. Go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where you can get a bunch of ebooks and reports. My way of saying thank you. And when you've got time, why not listen to some of the old podcasts? There's individual lessons in each of those that I think would be helpful for you. I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?